Good morning. You know, when Nate invited me here and I got the theme, justice, I was pleasantly surprised because this is a theme that's really core to who I am as a human being. But unfortunately, for whatever reason, I never really get asked to talk about this topic, rarely. It's usually about things like innovation, you know, design thinking, problem-solving type of processes. And so I am super humbled. I gotta say, you are my people. My first job was as a graphic designer, working in a small little print shop. And I know going from there and now working with all kinds of different marketing agencies as well as marketing teams within brands, working with executives of brands, trying to solve for solutions and trying to figure out problems is, I know your world is incredibly crazy. And so thank you for taking time. I was trying to do the math of like, how much would your time be worth if we collected, add up all of our hourly rates? And so this is a statement that says you believe in really investing in yourself and in each other. So thank you for being here. Well, I want to spend just a few minutes talking to you about this concept of justice, and the way that I want to frame it is just to give you eventually just kind of 3 practices that I try to do in my own life that maybe helps me live out what I think justice is. And justice, as most of you know, at its kind of foundational root idea is to make things right, or the sense of like, there's a sense that I think every human being believes that the world ought to be a certain way. And it's really in our behavior and our engagements that allow us to actualize that world. And we may not be able to always change the entire world, but I think we can change our world, whatever your world is. You know, when I think about justice at a very high level, I think of like iconic images like this. From Baton Rouge a couple of years ago, it's probably one of the photographs of the century, potentially. And when you think about it at this grand level, it gets very complex really quick. There are dynamics of both the private sector, the public sector. There's nonprofit organizations, for-profit businesses, individuals, influencers, systemic issues, and you start layering all of that in, and it feels like incredibly overwhelming. So I am not here in a quick 20-minute talk to give you solutions for that. But what I can do is to try to bring it down to think about what we can all do, whether you're creative, you're a founder, you're a business owner, you work for, the man, or whoever you work for or work with and work because of, I think justice can be embedded into how we live as human beings. Does that sound good? So I'm going to take you back. When I was 5 years old, my parents and I, we immigrated to the United States and landed in this small little city called Manhattan. And that was my first introduction to the United States. And, I quickly realized that as an immigrant, things were not fair. My parents had given up their careers. One was in fashion, the other was doing design. And we came to the States and we realized, man, we absolutely had nothing. I remember our first vehicle, bought for $200. It had 4 doors, 2 windows. And the other was kind of like, kind of the saran wrap fill. And I remember, New York gets really cold. And so every morning we would go and my mother would get dropped off working at a garment factory. My father would go to his job. They'll take me to school. I will walk back home as a, 5, 6-year-old in New York. And it was just kind of an intense environment. And watching them go from there to eventually we moved out to Los Angeles. And they started in the restaurant industry, and long story short, they built several franchises. And anybody love Korean barbecue? So they were some of the early innovators of cooking at the table, and some of the dishes have now become staple in our culture. But what I realized is at every step, there were all these like barriers to them. They didn't speak the language. Often they would be attacked by competitors because of the relationships. I remember once we got shut down for 6 months for doing what every other restaurant was doing, was cooking on the table. because one of the competitors convinced a council member to figure out a way to create some violation for our restaurant. So it's like at every stage, I realized that there are people who held power and authority that could quickly find points where they could oppress people who didn't have that power or authority. And over time, I realized that, man, I really didn't fit in. Even now, it's very awkward at times because I don't have the right, pedigree to be in the rooms that I'm in. I don't have often the right color to be expected to do certain things. I mean, you all think I'm good in math, but I'm not. So it can work towards the advantage too, right? And I was always like, if you've ever felt like, I think all of us at some level feel like a misfit, feel like we don't belong, we're not good enough, or there are just inherent obstacles. I mean, when I talk with female entrepreneurs, there are just like systemic, cultural, probably things like implicit bias that are just kind of happening all around us. But what I also realize is that there are people like you and I that are committed to making our world better. That they would go out of their way to create access. That they would go out of their way to change systems so that we can get to a place that we desire to get to. Is that fair? I think most of us, hopefully in this room, are committed to that. So when I think of justice, what I love about it is it's really about a world of we. I remember reading actually St. Jerome years ago, and he talks about the virtue of justice being a greater virtue than most other virtues. Because most virtues, you can find pleasure in yourself. But in order to experience the pleasure of justice, it requires you helping somebody outside of yourself. And so here's what I would like for you to do. I want to just do a quick 30-minute exercise, if you would, just entertain me. Is why don't you stand up, no talking. We're going to practice silence. Everyone stand up. Find one person you can actually face. Just pair up. You don't need to talk. You could do it like communicate with your eyes. Okay, here's what I want you to do. Face them. I want you to put your hand on your right hand on their left shoulder. Okay? No. This shouldn't be that hard. Okay? All right, here's what I want you to do. Okay? Look at me here. For the next 20 seconds, just 20 seconds, you're not going to speak. You're just going to look right into their eyes. Okay? No talking. Ready? Go. You guys are doing so well. We're going to do 10 more seconds. All right, go ahead and sit down. All right. How did you feel? Awkward, right? Right? Here's the thing about our culture, and I'm generalizing, and generalizations are probably not accurate completely. But generally speaking, we live in a culture where we kind of want our own space. We'll pay for more leg room, and we'll do things like that because we want a sense of we want, space so that we have, where we can put our elbows. Some of you guys are incredibly tall, and you're like, man, you don't want to be cramped while you travel. I think space is almost like an inherent, we feel like we should be entitled to space. And when we talk about justice, the first practice I want to talk to you about is actually something that I'm calling social hospitality. And it's, in order to live a life of justice, we have to be willing to live a life that's interrupted. To allow other human beings to enter a space that's really close to us that we're normally not comfortable for strangers to enter space. And what really hit home for me was like, I'll often go through these stretches where I'll just read up on a particular topic. I actually studied philosophy in grad school, and I just have these random interests. So one summer, I read through an Algebra 2 book. Just because, right? And then one summer, I studied like ancient Near East type of hospitality, because I thought that was an interesting concept. And in the ancient Near East, often there would, long time ago, there were no hotels or motels. So where did the people stay? In each other's homes. And in many of the cultures in the Near East, which could kind of cover everywhere from like Egypt to where present-day Israel, places like Turkey, present-day Turkey is, what they would do is they would go through this, almost like this unwritten a ritual where a stranger would come into town and a family would offer to take them in. And they would go through these like unspoken things like, the host was expected to provide the needs of the guests, but not overwhelm them with all the stuff they had. They would slowly build up, maybe offer some water, then some, things to nibble on. They would give more of a meal and more. And in the same way, the one receiving the hospitality would be keen to figure out ways to show expressions of gratitude. At the end of the trip, they may leave a live animal with them as a sign of a leaving life, because they felt like they were encouraged. And, there was always this kind of a dance in hospitality. And a good host lived between two extremes. One extreme would be to basically don't ask the guest anything, right? Just let him be. But the other extreme would be to ask him too much. And if they did this right, over time, their trust in each other would build. Maybe it's a day, maybe it's a couple of days, usually not more than a few days. But by the end of their stay, the family would present the stranger who came in as a friend to the community. And for me, that's a really visual picture, I think, of what hospitality in the context of justice may look like. Is we have to be willing to let people enter our space that are not normally in our ecosystem, if you will. I mean, from a creative benefit, it's awesome because isn't innovation often when like 2 or 3 or more unrelated concepts intersect? Every year I try to go to a conference outside of my profession because I just want to see how people think about problems. And so there's a lot of like practical benefits from being around people that are not like you and me. And so, one of the ways that we kind of expressed this is years ago, a good friend of mine who was working with often like the working poor, sometimes people who are houseless, and he would serve people in the community. And he asked one guy, his name was T-Bone. He recently passed away, but his name is T-Bone. And, he said, what do you need? And T-Bone said, look, I can go to the missions to get food. There's lots of charities that I can turn to. But what I would really like are some clean clothes. And so my friend and I, he told me about this, and we started creating some movement around this and said, hey, what if we went into laundromats and offered the free washing of clothes? And this is what T-Bone says. He says, if I had clean clothes, I think people would treat me like a human being. Because he realized, man, suddenly, when he had clean clothes, police officers treated him a little bit differently. He felt a little bit more human. And when you look at the numbers of kids who are maybe even homeless that have dirty clothes that go to school, often it's really hard for them to succeed, not because they're not smart enough, but often they're ostracized because of maybe what they're wearing, what they may smell like. And so we started a simple idea of like getting groups of people to go to laundromats and just put quarters in machines and just spend time with people and not even offer a service, just listen. And then eventually through that type of hospitality, you begin to find the needs. And some locations started offering after-school tutoring because we soon realized some families were literally choosing between laundry or dinner some days. And then slowly this idea kind of grew. And we've been doing this for a long time now. And now we have over 325 locations around the country that serve people every month to do that. But it all starts with hospitality. We always say the founder of Laundry Love is T-Bone. It was not our idea. It was not in some type of strategic boardroom. It was literally listening to the very ones you want to serve. And if you think about it from a business perspective, I mean, think about human-centered design, design thinking, things like empathy. I mean, it's so common sense. And I guess we could put cool terms around it, and suddenly it's something new. But if we could listen to others and allow them to enter our space, I think we will become a far more just world. The other thing that I've seen in our work is we work with lots of different corporate brands and law firms and tech companies and automotive and all these different groups. And what we've seen is that if you want to make a culture more just, it has to be systemic activation. It's really hard to create change when you're just talking about it. I work a lot in the area of ideas. Like, some of us have had the same idea for a very long time. Do you know some studies kind of suggest that if you talk about the idea over and over without writing it down, just keep talking about it, you're less likely to actually implement it, because talking about it tricks your brain into thinking you're actually doing something about it. And I think this is true of justice issues. Like, of course, everybody wants more of a just culture at work or in their neighborhood. But talking about it alone won't change anything, because ideas are impotent without action. And so this is a commitment that if you are running a business or you're part of a team, and some of us are in contexts where you can't change the entire culture. Like if you're working at Google right now, you probably can't change the entire culture. Eric Schmidt probably can't even change the entire culture. But what we can do is, once again, it's not the entire world, it's our world. Maybe you lead a team to think intentionally about what kind of culture are you setting, what kinds of things are you talking about, and is justice a part of that? Not just a cause, but why you are even pushing a cause. And what are some of the implicit biases that are running through our talk, our nomenclature, running through the way that we engage one another, the way that decisions are made, how advancement can or cannot happen? What are subtle things that we do that prevent people from becoming the full version of themselves? And this is really systemic. Some of you are working with a lot of different clients and customers. Are there things you can do in your creativity, in the way you design, the way you market, the way you tell your stories, the way you build products, that those products and the pieces that you create as a creative are actually inspiring hope for the type of world we all want to see? And I believe you're already doing that. I'm just here to remind you that that's what you're doing. Has very little to do with making things look beautiful. I think we can make things look very beautiful. But I think we want to solve for problems too. And that's where I see the difference between creativity and innovation. Is creativity as a subset of innovation, but it's not the same thing, because usually innovation deals with problem solving. And hopefully we could be committed to trying to figure out systemic ways to make a difference in our companies and our communities, and hopefully, eventually, different parts of our world. And the last thing I would say is that another practice is sacrificial generosity. You can be generous, I think, passively. And I've always been challenged that my generosity has to feel, at some point, uncomfortable. My wife and I, we always ask each other, like, what's enough? What's enough? And then the question is not so much, can we live with a little bit more? We always think in terms of like, can we live with a little bit less if it means that we could kind of create a little bit more impact? And it's really, really hard sometimes. But the type of generosity that I'm talking about is not just money, it's time. It's advocating for a new idea even though you've heard 1,000 new ideas. It's connecting people to one another when it's hard, because your network is, some people say your network is your net worth, right? And it's hard because, you don't want to share everything because maybe your network doesn't want to hear everyone you're connected with. But I know as one who's experienced like barriers and invisible walls and that I just couldn't get into a particular room, is that if it weren't for people who said, you know what, I'm going to go out of my way because I believe in you, and I'm going to be in friendship with you to go through this. And this image, why is there a food table, is because I think at the end of the day, we are once again trying to move from being strangers to people you kind of know to hopefully actual friends. And hopefully that's what this community is about. And that kind of sacrificial generosity. And so like when we do like our conferences and events as a company, we always try to make sure that our motives are correct, that we will not profit from any event, and that we can partner with people who want to invest in others so that they can achieve their dreams. My life mission is to reduce the percentage of people who take their ideas to the grave. I'm more about execution. I think ideas are awesome, but they're just ideas. And what I want to help people do is, how do we get from point A to point B, or point A1? And eventually, over time, you're going to get there. And so, when we do our conference, I love it because often I'll call friends, and I'll call friends like, Ryan Sisson and Nate and others, like, hey, I'm throwing this event. I can't pay you anything. Would you come? And then Nate goes, well, then you got to come. No. But the idea is nobody has ever said no, really. And these are like people who make a living speaking, some of them. Because they know really the heart of any gathering that we try to facilitate is not to pitch our business, but to help people get to their next stage of their idea growth. And so sacrificial generosity, is it expensive? Absolutely. But we can do this, these little acts. So it kind of looks like this, and I'll end in like a minute, is that if we have social hospitality, if we have some type of systemic activation, and not just talk, and if we had some level of sacrificial generosity where we felt a little bit uncomfortable and yet we know it's good, that if we can have those moments in our lives, and if, I know there are a lot of entrepreneurs in the room, you understand delayed gratification and sacrificial generosity. But keeping generous. We need a generous world in order to open doors to find, so that we can get to justice. I'll leave with this quote from a Duke professor. He said, "Justice is love embodied." And if I can encourage you with anything today, is that let's do our part to make this world a little bit more just. Not for ourselves only, but for each other. And I think if we do it together, we're actually going to get there. Thank you.